Hello everyone, and welcome to this summer HazMaTON webinar. My name is Jerome Marty, and I am the Executive Director of the International Associations for Great Lakes Research, a member organization of the Hazardous Material Transport Outreach Network, or HazMaTON. Our network is a binational collaborative of specialists from the Great Lakes, Lake Champlain, Hudson River, and the St. Lawrence River regions focused on reducing risks associated with multiple modes of oil and other hazardous materials transportation. The collaborative is committed to the dissemination of accurate, neutral, and data-driven information through education, outreach, and relationship building in order to improve public safety, the region's economy, and environmental stewardship of our water resources. To that end, we are pleased to bring you the second webinar of our 2023 summer webinar series. These webinars will be taking place monthly through September. Today's webinar, entitled Marine Firefighting, Preventing Environmental Threats While Saving Lives and Property, will describe the unique challenges of the marine firefighting industry and provide case studies from the US, including the Great Lakes region. This summer, we will bring you webinars on topics such as marine firefighting, the role of a federal on-scene coordinator, and oil behavior in freshwater. You may register for multiple webinars within this series at once. More information and registration is available on the HazMaTON webinar webpage. Before we get started, I would like to share a few logistic points with you. The first one is that the webinar is being recorded and will be shared on our online platform. The recording with closed captions will be made publicly available on the Minnesota Sea Grants YouTube channel and on the HazMaTON Material Transport Outreach Network website. And we invite you to submit questions, comments, or technical challenges at any time via the question and answer box in your Zoom toolbar. Geneva Langland is going to be helping with the Q&As and will assist with any questions you may have during the webinar. Audience members can upload questions if they are interested in having them answered live. And we will be collecting those for the question and answer that will take place following the presentation. It is my great pleasure to introduce you today's presenter. Jim Elliott is the Chief Operating Officer of the Techman Group of Companies. I don't know if we say of companies always. Jim, you can correct me.
There's a few companies involved, but yes, thank you.
Okay. He is responsible for managing worldwide marine salvage, firefighting, heavy lift, commercial diving, and emergency response operation while simultaneously managing multiple companies. In addition of attaining the United States' highest Type 1 Incident Commander certification, Mr. Elliott also qualified as a Coast Guard Federal On-Scene Coordinator, Commanding Officer, Captain of the Port, National Strike Force Response Officer, and Type 1 Planning and Operations Section Chief. His professional certifications are numerous and include Certified Environmental Professional, Certified Environmental, Safety and Health Trainer, Certified Hazardous Material Manager, and Registered Environmental Professional. I'm going to skip all the acronyms here. He's also certified to teach Incident Command System, HazWooper, Weapon and Mass Destruction Operations, and International Maritime Organization's Oil Spills Response courses. As a Type 1 Incident Commander on Coast Guard Incident Management Teams and the National Strike Force, he responded to many of the nation's largest response operations, including the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Yvonne, and Ike, and the Deepwater Horizon response, plus hundreds of major oil spills and marine casualty incidents. As a salvage industry executive, he has worked on every continent and has been sought out to present and consult on marine casualty response best practices worldwide. Mr. Elliott holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Management with distinction, a Master of Environmental Policy with honors, Master of Arts in national security and strategic studies with highest distinctions from the U.S. Naval War College, and an MBA with merit from the University of London. He has earned over 75 Coast Guard state and industry awards and medals, including selection into the Coast Guard's Leadership Hall of Fame and the ADCI Commercial Diving Hall of Fame. Jim is also a past president of the American Salvage Association. With this introduction, I'm going to need to take some water after this. I'm going to pass the microphone and the line to Jim. Welcome, Jim, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen here, and we'll start with the presentation. Let me make sure we're doing this. Can everybody see that?
Oh, good.
Perfect. Okay. So I gave this presentation at a Great Lakes conference earlier in the year, and I was happy that people were listening, and I was invited to talk today. I think it's a very, marine firefighting is a very important issue. Just this month, tragically, 2 Newark firefighters lost their life on board a cargo carrier at the dock. This morning I looked up recent firefighting statistics, and just this year, the U.S. Fire Administration reports that 45 firefighters have lost their life just this year. So, I spent most of my life in the U.S. Coast Guard. I spent 26 years in the Coast Guard. My focus was marine safety and search and rescue and preventing loss of life and protecting the environment. So this is a topic that's pretty important to me, pretty important to our company, and we try to help people to properly train, equip, and get experience in this type of work. Interestingly, today I get reports every day of marine casualties around the world. There's a large roll-on, roll-off cargo carrier on fire in the North Sea with over 2,800 cars on board. So they've evacuated the crew. So this is a pretty timely topic, and I look forward to giving you a presentation. So I just want to give you a quick look at what we see when we come on scene. We see we're going in when others are being taken off the ship. So I always tell people we don't get called in until everybody else has tried everything they can do on board to put out the fire. And we often meet people really on their worst days. They never expected this to happen. So this is just starting out to give you just some visuals of what we deal with. This was a tank ship fire in the Gulf of Mexico, and it was carrying flammable products, multiple cargo tanks, and we use, in addition to trained, experienced marine firefighters and portable fire equipment, we use salvage tugs, and one of the takeaways is always use infrared, so you know where the fire is and where it remains. It may look like it's out, the fire is out. This is an example of the fire was out in the cargo holds, but even the stern of the vessel, because of the heat that had been transferred, had caught flammable materials in the stern compartment, in the steering compartment. So you can see that infrared show that there's still fire inside the ship. This is just a shot. There was another roll-on, roll-off cargo carrier that capsized in St. Simons Sound, Georgia, and this is just a shot of the team that was on board. There were 4 crew members trapped inside, and this was a success story. The 4 crew members were saved, and the wreck was ultimately removed. So today, an overview of the presentation, I'm going to give you some background on a little bit about myself and firefighting side, and then our company, and then I'll discuss the regulatory issues which are very important. It lays the framework for how we respond and kind of the rules of engagement for marine firefighting. And then several case studies that show you a lot of photos, and then some lessons learned that we can discuss at the end. Just give you some quick background. Our company, Teichman Group, includes T&T Salvage, which is a salvage marine firefighting service provider. We're also an oil spill response organization. I think we're one of the only salvage companies that has an office based in the Great Lakes. I started my career in the Great Lakes, actually in the U.S. Coast Guard, and probably when I was about 21 years old, helped fight a marina fire from a Coast Guard boat. So I started my career with marine firefighting, and I've been engaged in that for some time. We work with a lot of oil and gas producers and a lot of shipping companies, and we do a lot of tank vessel response operations. So you can see the different kinds of companies we work with. And then we have, to do this, we have pre-positioned equipment all around the US and all around the world. And we work with a lot of different organizations, subcontractors, and we try to work with municipal firefighters to work together to have plans in place. We're always doing exercises and drills. Coming up this month, within the next couple of months, we're doing exercises in New York, Houston, Corpus Christi. So with that said, I wanted to give you the foundational regulatory basis for doing this type of work and how it all works together. So these response priorities are found in the National Contingency Plan, and that's 40 CFR 300 if anybody wants to look up the regulations. But it basically gives the national priorities for a response to a vessel. And as always, the first priority is safety of human life, has to be given the top priority. And after that, stabilizing the situation to prevent it from getting worse. Next priority, it says that all efforts must be focused on saving a vessel that's been involved in a grounding, collision, fire, explosion, so that it does not compound the problem. And these defensive actions shall begin as soon as possible to protect the public and the environment. So pretty broad objectives, priorities for the nation. And then it wasn't until 2008 that the Coast Guard produced salvage and marine firefighting regulations. And it was pretty historic because the US is the only country in the world that has these types of regulations that really define what salvage and marine firefighting is. And it lists, I have a slide that you can look at as I talk through it, but there's actually timelines, planning timelines for vessel owners to respond. The rest of the world and the way it used to work in the US was that a marine casualty would happen, a fire would happen, and then the owner would have various salvage companies and firefighting companies offering their services. A contract would have to be executed, and all that process would take time, right? And marine firefighting is a time critical response operation. It doesn't get better with time. You need to contain it. You need to put out the fire. So obviously, I think it's a good step, and it also encourages exercises and drills and working together within a unified command with the Coast Guard, the state, and the vessel owner to come together to expeditiously and efficiently respond. If you look through these, there's a laundry list of what we call salvage and marine firefighting services. In the regulations, there are 19 of them. And the way we look at marine firefighting, it's a holistic effort to save the vessel and the cargo on board. And we typically work for the ship owners, the insurance companies, to do this once lives have been saved, once the crew is safe. And it's not just putting water or foam on the ship. We need to make sure that it's stable. We want to plan for emergency repairs, emergency towing. So if you look through this list, there's in the Great Lakes, there is these response time in hours. So within the first hour of getting a notification, we have to do a remote assessment or a consultation. So a lot can be done in this time period. A lot of times, vessel crews are overwhelmed. They may not be thinking about the basics of so. For example, the majority of fires when a vessel's underway is an engine room fire, typically. And you want to contain that. You want to seal off the engine room, shut off the ventilation, shut off the electrical fuel to that space. And typically there's a fixed firefighting system. You activate that. And we talk through those issues with the master or the qualified individual to try to make sure everything's under control. And then we assess the stability of the vessel. So how we differ from typical municipal firefighters is that we have pumps that we can pump off fuel, we can pump off the water that's going on board to keep the vessel stable. So it's as you can see, there's actually plans that have to be put together, pre-fire plans. I should say that this applies to vessels that are required to have a vessel response plan. So in the Great Lakes, there's a lot of less than 400 gross tons, smaller vessels. So recreational vessels are not covered by this, and it's typically municipal firefighters that are going on board. These are large commercial vessels. And so this is the timelines for firefighting. Again, it shows you that there's at the pier, and then within the Great Lakes, the response time in hours. We have to bring, again, the remote consultation, do an on-site assessment, and then have external firefighting teams and external firefighting systems that may include tugs, portable fire pumps, even aircraft that can drop firefighting foam or water on the vessel. So these really, if you're interested in reading the regulations, it's 7 pages in 33 CFR 155. And if anyone's interested, I can share those with you. But it continues to evolve. Prior to the regulations, there were hundreds of companies listed on salvage marine firefighting vessel response plans. And now there's only a handful because there's a review or a vetting process by the Coast Guard. And now if a company is named on that vessel response plan and the captain of the port or federal and sea coordinator decides to use a different company, then they have to report that to Congress. So there's a period, kind of a bureaucratic process to go through, and the goal hopefully is to not delay needed operations. So again, when you think about salvage marine firefighting services from a salvage company, you're getting a lot of different services. Importantly, you have trained, experienced mariners, people that have worked on vessels their entire life. They understand how to move around a vessel. We have naval architects that are trained in not just ship design, but how to remedy a situation when the vessel is not in the state it was designed to be in. All of our salvage technicians, firefighters, are trained in hazardous material response and how to wear self-contained breathing apparatus and those types of things. So our teams are trained to go on board and to understand how to move around a vessel. They have the plans to the vessel, and typically one of the lessons is you never want to fully evacuate the crew. You would want to have a senior officer on board, a chief mate, an engineer that understands the ship systems, so we can efficiently manage those during a marine casualty event. I mentioned thermal imaging. We even use unmanned aerial vehicles, drones with thermal imaging to fly around a vessel to pinpoint where the hot spots or the fires. So there's regulatory requirements for vessels over 400 gross ton to have pre-fire plans set up in their vessel response plan. That plan should be distributed. So for example, if we work with the municipal firefighters and we have an agreement in place, they would have access to those plans. Often a lot of companies, their plans are proprietary. So it's very important to have those access to those so we can quickly move around the vessel, understand the ship systems, and respond. We just an example of one, just that we have consent agreements with municipal firefighters. This is one with Sturgeon Bay that we work together, and we even recently put a fire pump with the fire company there. This photo is a fire at a dry dock in Sturgeon Bay. So I mentioned this. Public Fire Service brings trained and experienced firefighters. One of the issues is that they're oftentimes not specifically trained in marine operations. The Newark Fire Department, the mayor and others have said that the team that initially went on board, the municipal firefighters, had not been trained in cargo ship firefighting. So a lot of times it may be prudent to contain the fire and wait till marine firefighters that are experienced in that particular type of vessel can get on board. I mentioned commercial firefighters bring the naval architects to manage ship stability and removing the water, removing the oil, and protecting the cargo. These are some old statistics from FEMA, but it kind of it gives you some perspective on where we stand when it comes to specifically marine firefighting. So in the U.S., majority of firefighters are volunteers, and a lot of times their budgets don't allow for expansive training programs, and marine firefighting is often few and far between. So they have to prioritize where they're spending their training. And then there's less than 4%. I don't know what the number is today. This was a few years ago, but say less than 10% are trained in marine firefighting. Small number. And the consent agreements, there needs to be more of those to work together so that municipal, industrial, and commercial firefighters can all work together and exercise together. So it was mentioned I retired from the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard is actually the incident commander for any fire on board a vessel that's at anchor underway. So what's the role of the Coast Guard? It's interesting that so I've been doing this for a while. I started in the Coast Guard in the mid 80s, and at that time we actually trained to fight fires externally, commercial vessels. And around the mid 90s, the Coast Guard decided they don't really have the expertise or the capacity to do that, and they referred to commercial firefighters to do that type of work. But they still have regulatory control over vessel movement, over the review of the vessel response plan. They are in the unified command when an incident happens. Interestingly, the Coast Guard's policy is they only fight fires on their own vessels, but they coordinate, and it's a very important role. If anybody watched the recent fire in Newark, you would see that the Coast Guard and the state and the port and the firefighters formed a unified command, so that they were all working on the same objectives. I mentioned unified command. This is the based on the National Incident Management System. It's an incident command system model that's required by governments, the U.S. government in particular, that this is how we respond. Everybody speaks the same language and works together on common objectives with a common single incident action plan to solve an incident. And as you can see, it's operations, there's planning, there's logistics to move equipment and personnel and support the responders that are on scene. You want to have public information officers for crisis communications, safety officer to make sure that everybody is aligned and safe. And I highlighted the functional group. Typically, that's where the salvage and marine firefighting teams work together in operations. But as you can see, it's a proven system that is used and should be used immediately on every response. So now with the regulatory side, I'm just going to talk about a little bit of equipment, show you some photos. These are a lot of our portable firefighting systems that we have pre-positioned around the US. We have lightering systems, which we can pump water and oil cargo and other types of cargo, liquid cargoes, even molasses, really thick cargoes, heavy cargoes, to move the cargo off the ship to another receiving vessel. We have equipment that's unique to the marine salvage industry, which is inert gas systems and nitrogen generators. So when oil cargo is carried in bulk and carried in tank vessels, it needs to be maintained in an inert status. I ended with specialized equipment that we use. I talked about the aerial, unmanned aerial vehicles, drones to use infrared. And then one of the big issues in marine firefighting is the use of AFFF, which contains persistent toxic chemicals. We responded to various incidents where there's been spills of AFFF in the Great Lakes. And so we use a more environmentally friendly foam. So we try to use the latest technology to make sure that we're protecting the environment. So with that said, I'm going to quickly go through some marine firefighting case studies. This was the Tecumseh Great Lakes carrier that had a fire in the engine room. We responded to this. It was relatively it was a good success. We worked with both the U.S. and Canadian government to get on board, and it was interesting. It said from a recent article, it says from the Canadian Transportation Board, it said the responders remained on shore, providing boundary cooling while awaiting the arrival of firefighters with marine training, who arrived about 2 hours later to put out the fire. So one of the lessons is sometimes it's good to just contain it and wait, keep the oxygen in an oxygen-free environment if all possible, with hitting the fixed system, so that you can ensure that properly trained people on board. Just this year, the Cuyahoga had a fire on board in the engine room. Another success. The fire was contained and made it safely to dock. So everybody was safe on board. So just an example that these types of incidents do happen around the world and in the Great Lakes. And we try to work with everyone to achieve a successful outcome. So I'm going to give you a few. These are some good visuals, give you the kind of an idea of the type of scenarios we get involved in. This was a tug and barge that hit a pressurized gas pipeline in South Louisiana. You can see that the propeller of the tug penetrated the pipeline and served as the ignition source. So we were called in to respond to this. The goal, you can see that the types of environments we're working in, and the goal was to break away the barge once everyone was safe on board, get everybody off, to break away the barge to save the cargo. So this is a photo of our firefighters going in, breaking away that barge, and ultimately that oil cargo, I think 93,000 barrels, was transferred off to save that barge, save the cargo, and ultimately, as you can see the foam on the surface of the water, the tug was a constructive total loss. So we ended up removing the tug. You can see how devastating marine fire can be. Another example was there were 2 tank barges that were relatively empty, only residuals. They were at a cleaning facility in Mobile, Alabama. And I'll show you this image real quick. This was caught by a security camera. You can see the power of the explosion. And you'll see a piece of the tank top, a large piece of steel go through the air. So one of the things that we do is we work with municipal firefighters to say, look, it's probably not safe to go in. I mean, a lot of people want to go, a lot of responders, obviously their heart's in the right place. They want to put out the fire, but oftentimes it's not the most safe thing to go in immediately. You can see the destructive power of the explosion. This is a steel tank barge that was ripped apart. Piping from the barge was shot through Connex containers on the dock. This is a Mobile Fire Department. We worked together with them, and the responders were not injured on this. You see how close they are to other, one of the things you need to think about is how close are you to other vessels and other infrastructure. And there was a cruise ship just right across the waterway. We respond around the world. This is an example of an international response in Panama. We were called in. There was a fire in a container. I guess it spontaneously combusted. And the municipal firefighters in Panama wanted to go on board and fill this vessel with water. So our goal is to, is to save the ship and the cargo. So we did thermal imaging and we found the location of the fire. But the crew on board had already discharged all the CO2 fixed firefighting systems. So we immediately ordered up additional bottles to replace that, so we have backup when we go on board. These are the kind of drawings that give you an insight of what we're looking at. You can see that container was below and several other rows of containers. So we in marine firefighting, we're using heavy lift and cranes and other resources to find that fire and isolate it. We often train the crew on board. They might not have the best training, so we give them just-in-time training, and then we get a plan in place while everybody's aligned to go on board, remove the container, and then isolate it, and then put out the fire. So obviously, economically and from an environmental perspective, it's better to do it more surgically as opposed to just pouring water onto it. This is another case study. This was in the Houston Ship Channel, and there was a barge collision, and this is just the local news headlines. This shows you the marine firefighting. So it was a naphtha barge on fire. The Port of Houston had expended all their firefighting foam, and we were called in to assist them. And you will see the fire. Ultimately, we switched to this product called PyroCool, which is a cooling agent. So we have different types of materials to put out the fire. And around 45 seconds into the firefighting, we switched over, and the fire was out rather quickly. Within this response, we work with, again, we're in a unified command. We work with the Coast Guard, the state regulatory agencies, and the owner to make sure that we're all aligned. So a good success getting the fire out, and ultimately that barge, the remaining cargo, was lightered off. So that was, we work around the clock. That was a nighttime operation. You can see the sun rising over the Houston Ship Channel, and we kept cooling the barge to ambient before we got on board. Here's an example of where a municipal fire department went on board a fire in Louisiana. This was several years ago, but it can show you what happens when you put excessive water on board a vessel. The crew was taken off, and the municipal firefighters just continued to put water on board. They even cut a hole in the side of the ship to put water in. There was no marine salver called in until the vessel was ultimately, you can see the photo on the right, ultimately sunk at dock. And this is a large, you can see the size of the vessel because it has a helideck on the forward part of it, on the bow. You can see the firefighting efforts, a lot of work, and ultimately the fire was out, but the vessel sank. Another lesson, I'm sure everybody online is familiar with the Deepwater Horizon event. You can see the firefighting operations going on. These were all Good Samaritans, all offshore supply vessels. And I just kind of refer you to the investigation report performed by the Coast Guard, that the marine firefighting water that was placed on board may have ultimately caused it to sink before the fire was extinguished. So when you think about water, you think about weight, the weight of that you're putting on board the vessel, and you need to think about how you can tactically use the best amount of water in the right locations and be able to remove that water if possible. So I'll let you read this, but applying 8,000 gallons of water per minute using both their fire mains, it was quite a bit of tonnage going on board this vessel. And finally, this case study in Corpus Christi, Texas is a lesson to, before you go on board a vessel that's on fire, to what we call activate the best response plan. Make sure we have that regulatory process in place, that we're doing consultations. The fire department went on board, a municipal fire department went on board, and unfortunately, they went down multiple levels. A few firefighters were overcome by smoke, and they didn't really work with the ship's crew. They didn't look at ship's plans before they went on board. They were focused on putting out the fire, which is a noble thing, but ultimately, there was injuries involved. And this is what was being carried: wind turbine motors for these large wind farms. And from a safety perspective, when you're walking around a vessel, there's many hazards. And this shows if the fire crew that was on board, the team that was on board, had continued on in the path they were going, they could have potentially dropped into a large cargo hold. I can't emphasize enough the importance of understanding ship design and limitations when you're going on board. So I will just review some of the lessons and takeaways. We recommend that when there's a fire on board, that you activate the best response plan. It doesn't cost anything from a marine salver to just give us a call and maybe do that just remote assessment where we're giving some advice. Get a trained marine firefighter online to talk with the captain, talk through the options, talk about isolating the fire, make sure that the crew is safe. Again, integrate municipal fire, industrial and commercial firefighters together. This is it's a unique type of operation. Marine firefighting, and it's good to exercise and train together. For the ports, I recommend formalizing marine firefighting agreements in ports with municipal firefighters along the water, again, to make sure that we can drill and exercise and respond together. When going on board, you need to leverage and value the ship's crew. They understand that vessel more than anyone else. They have the fire control plans. They have the plans for the vessel. They understand the ship's systems. So it's very important to be able to work with them. And their goal also, of course, is to, you're aligned. You want to put out the fire. You want to save the vessel. On the technology side, I can't emphasize enough infrared technology, making sure for the protection and safety of personnel and to expedite finding the hot spots and how to put out the fire. Transitioning from firefighting foam that may have toxic chemicals that are persistent in the environment to alternative firefighting foams that are safe in the environment. We could do a whole webinar on lithium batteries, a big issue for our industry, for transportation, all transportation modes. But we need to be very aware of how they're stowed, how they're transported. And having served in the Coast Guard for 26 years, I believe the Coast Guard should assume a leadership position in integrating all of the different, coordinating all the different organizations to more effectively prepare and prevent fires in the ports and on the waterways. And finally, just a side note, for responding to oil, we've been called in to actually light a fire, and this was an in situ burn, a burn of a oil spill in a wetland area, because oftentimes putting mechanical equipment in to try to recover the oil will cause more damage to the environment than leaving it in place. So this was called an in situ burn, and you can see that we use infrared there also. And that's my conclusion. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was a great presentation, and thanks to everybody for bearing with us as we had our little technical blip in the middle. Once again, this is Geneva Langland with Michigan Sea Grant. I have a handful of great questions in the Q&A box, but we've got about 15 minutes to do the Q&A. So if there are still burning questions out there, and that was not a marine firefighting pun, feel free to drop them in. We will start with one from Kate, who is a volunteer firefighter in Minnesota. Kate is grateful for the work that you and all firefighting teams do, and is wondering if there are new types of foam being developed for marine firefighting that avoid PFAS and other forever chemicals. Or I guess the first question is, are marine firefighting foams as at risk of PFAS contamination as terrestrial ones?
So historically, yes. I mean, the AFFF that I used in the Coast Guard when I was just starting out my career. And as you know, I mean, that was the commonly used throughout the firefighting industry. As you said, it has PFAS, it has, and I'm not a chemist, but it has persistent chemicals. It's a big issue on military bases, big issue throughout the country. So to answer the question, yes, we have moved to a non-PFAS containing foam. It's a cooling agent called PyroCool. There's other products on the market, but there's a big push to do that. One of the issues that everyone has is if you have an inventory of this type of foam, is how to dispose of it, and it's pretty it can be costly. I would say the sooner the better is to transition. That was one of my lessons, is transition to an environmentally safer foam. It's a big issue, and we could do a whole webinar on this, but it's a big issue in the firefighting community, obviously. And thanks for the question. Okay.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Mark Burrows is wondering what it's like working across the US-Canadian border. And I guess that would go for other incidents where there are international governments involved in responses.
Yeah, so logistics is a big issue in the salvage industry. I graduated from the War College, and one of the lessons is wars are won by logistics, moving personnel and equipment, getting it there in a timely manner. So it can be an issue, cross-boundary issues. The U.S. Coast Guard has an agreement with the Canadian government for response, and that typically in an emergency situation facilitates that. But I was actually just up in Vancouver, British Columbia, climbing with my son a couple of weeks ago, and I'm reminded of that whenever I cross into another country is how do we get our personnel in there quickly. So yes, it can be an issue. Work permits for like a prolonged operation. Obviously, we respect the firefighters and the companies that are in Canada that can do this type of work also. So we get called in by the vessel owner, and then we work with the governments to help facilitate that. So a lot of what I do, my background is in, teaching its command system, working with liaisoning with other governments. So the more you can do, the lesson here, I guess, is that there's a standard phrase that says, don't exchange business cards in the middle of the night during an emergency response. Plan for these types of operations so you can facilitate those cross-boundary issues.
Well, that speaks well to the next question from Patrick, who is with the U.S. Coast Guard in Duluth. And Patrick is wondering, what's the best way to coordinate involvement and participation and planning of area committee exercises for marine firefighting?
Patrick, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that question. So there's an area committee that should meet on a regular basis, and that's typically the avenue for these types of things. I would encourage any Coast Guard officer to look at best practices around the country. There's a lot of good work being done at various ports, and I don't think, as far as firefighting, contingency planning exercises. So, for example, we have an agreement with the Port of Corpus Christi. We're getting ready to do a large-scale exercise that includes industry, Coast Guard, state, commercial organizations all coming together to do a firefighting exercise. You can have a standalone marine firefighting committee within, or subcommittee within the area committee to encourage and bring in all the right players. It's interesting when you get everybody together, they have a lot of misperceptions of what each other's capabilities are. And I always like to we just lay everything out on the table and say, here, kind of do a gap analysis. What can we do? What can't we do? How do we improve on those types of things? But the big thing is just to get, you got to build that level of trust. I can tell you, we work with the New York Fire Department, and our lead firefighter is talking to them on a regular basis. So he's built that level of trust. If we're going into a port where we don't have those relationships, of course, there's going to say, why are these guys coming to the fire? What can they add? What value can they add? So doing these types of webinars, I try to educate people on the full suite of capabilities, but everybody, as you know, it's a team sport. Everybody needs to work together and get unified up front. I'm talking a lot, but one final thing I would say is that developing pre-incident action plans. The Coast Guard would be the federal on-scene coordinator for marine fire. Go ahead and walk through that process and find out who all those players are and what assignments they would have. So it will expedite and improve operations.
Great, thank you. On the subject of who has jurisdiction as the on-scene coordinator, Mark Burrows is wondering if there are any zones or incidents where US EPA might serve as OSC in the event of a fire.
So my understanding is in the coastal environment, the marine side, it's typically the US Coast Guard. For rail fires, US EPA's and other types of inland fires. Even so, we've responded to in the Ohio River, other inland rivers, and we typically work with the US Coast Guard. The EPA may be involved if it impacts their area responsibility. So I'm kind of making a generalization. There may be areas where that overlaps, but again, if you have a unified command, the EPA would have a seat at the table if they have jurisdiction or authority over that particular area. So there is a plan in place. I gave you the short version of the national contingency plan, those top priorities, and then below the national contingency plans, area contingency plans, and then local and state. So they all should all come together to form, a common plan on how we respond.
Absolutely, lots of players in the game. Jerome thanks you for your presentation and wonders about lithium batteries, since you mentioned those as one of the big upcoming challenges that the industry is facing. Jerome says that electric vehicle fires are certainly a big problem. It seems like letting them burn themselves out while cooling them down is often the best tactic, but are there other ways being looked at to target e-vehicle fires or anything exciting on the R&D front to help with those challenges?
Sure, there's several committees working on this. We're part of one national committee that's looking at it. Yeah, it's a big issue. I mean, thermal runaway. I've taken a few classes on lithium batteries, and typically it's put copious amounts of water on it, right? You don't have that. You often don't have that ability when you're on a ship, right? And that's why you see, like today, the Fremantle highway, that's the name of the vessel, is on fire with over 2,800 vehicles on board. So it's a big issue. There's a lot of, we looked at firefighting foam and how to have cooling agents that can go on board and quickly isolate and contain and put out the fire. It is an issue. There's, again, you could probably do a whole webinar on lithium batteries, but I wanted to mention there was a case just a few years ago, 2019, the motor vessel Conception off the West Coast. It was just a 75-foot dive boat, but 34 people, divers and crew, recreational divers, lost their lives. And they're questioning if that, all of the batteries, just small batteries for phones, cameras, those types of things, could have been the source of that fire. It's not just marine, it's land-based, as you know. So, Jerome, that's a great question. Maybe we can put together another webinar to cover that, because it is a very big issue for safety of life.
We'll squirrel that topic away for later. So keep an eye out, folks. There might be a lithium battery webinar popping up in the next round of webinars that we schedule. So we are coming close to our end. I want to pass along one shout out and then one final question. The shout out is from Guillermo Hernandez, who says he used to work with you, Jim, and is glad to see you on here. He is now with Donjon SMIT, which is located in Erie, Pennsylvania, and also has resources available for fighting marine fires in the Great Lakes. So he just wanted to give you a wave. And then
thanks for joining.
Final question is again from Kate, the volunteer firefighter in Minnesota. Kate says, as for the personnel who are actually doing the firefighting, can you give a brief explanation of the qualifications and the backgrounds that set someone up for that? Are there special schools or training certifications that someone could pursue? And how do people enter into those career opportunities?
Sure. So there are specialized training schools, marine firefighting. So the shipboard crew typically has what's called SCTW training to get their license. So they're trained in marine firefighting. There's plenty of schools around the world. We go to Texas A&M typically. There's also schools in Louisiana and other parts of the country specifically for marine firefighting. There's also like liquefied natural gas, LNG firefighting schools. So we go to a lot of those types of training. If you're welcome to share my contact and email information, I can send Katie some more information on how to get involved and how to get more training. And we welcome, we host, for example, we host Coast Guard personnel in industry training to teach them how, marine salvage side, and so they can understand the type of work we do. And we would welcome having, somebody come in and kind of do an apprenticeship with us. So we're very open to that.
Excellent. I'm going to drop your LinkedIn link into the chat, and I think that's one way that people can get in touch with you if they have questions about possibly entering into this training for their own career or for somebody that they know. And we are coming right up onto 1 o'clock Eastern. So I want to give a great big thank you to Jim for sharing your work with us today. Thank you to everyone who joined us, and to Jerome for helping to facilitate, and Kelsey Pryhoda, who is the coordinator of HazMaTON and is not able to join the webinar today, but did the heavy lifting to get everybody together into the same virtual room. And I'll invite everyone to join us on August 30 for the next installment of our 2023 summer webinar series. That one will be presented by Carl Pellegrino, who is the Federal On-Scene Coordinator for US EPA, which is one of the questions we talked about today. He's in Region 2, and he'll focus on spill preparedness and responses in the Lake Champlain region. So thank you once again, Jim. We'll be sending out the recording of this webinar to all registrants, and everything will be available on the HazMaTON website. Thanks to Jerome for dropping the link in the chat. And with that, we will close and say thank you again.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.